Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and before I get started with the video, I'm very sorry if you can at some point in this video hear a baby crying very loudly in my background. It's because in one of the flats next to mine, a baby or a small child has been crying on and off for the whole morning. So if you can hear a baby wailing, that's the reason. And now on to the video. Today's video is going to be books that changed my life. You can probably already tell by the title. And I was inspired to do this video because a couple of weeks ago I saw Piera Ford upload a video that was titled Fantasy Books That Changed My Life, I believe. And in that video she talked kind of about how books impacted her, and especially about how characters or specific characters impacted her. And when I thought about characters impacting me, I kind of came to a standstill. Because to be honest, I don't really find any characters in books that I relate to. There's one exception, which will be in this video, you will see later on. But mostly I relate more to situations, I relate more to character dynamics. I don't really relate that much to actual characters. I relate to parts of characters, but not to a character as a whole. And so the books that I'm going to talk about in this video don't exactly hold characters that I find relatable or that changed me or that reading about them changed me. But the thing that I'm going to talk about is just the books as a whole, why they changed me. Maybe they just changed specific aspects of my life. Maybe they just influenced a specific part of my character, now who I am as a person. And maybe it's just specific concepts, relationships, situations in those books that just made me think and made me change the way I look at things. And so yeah, I have 5 books here, 4 books and 1 comic series. And let me just get into them. I actually didn't read any of them after the age of 14, so for some reason I haven't found any books in the past 10 years that like changed my life as heavily and as much as those earlier books did, which I mean makes kind of sense because by now I'm a mostly fully formed person. And yeah, let me just get into them. I will talk about them in like how heavily they impacted me and not in the order that I read them in. So the first book I want to talk about maybe just changed one aspect of my personality, one aspect of who I am. But I would say that that aspect is a very important aspect to me right now, and it's probably one of the first things that most people think about, most of my friends think about when they think of me. And so that book that changed that part is Inkheart by Cornelia Funke. And the part this book changed is it changed how I read. Before I read this book, I basically just read. I read and I closed the book and it was fun and it's over. And that still sometimes is the case with like books that I don't find as engaging or that are maybe a little bit less well written. However, of course, in this book, like stories literally come to life. By the way, I can highly recommend it. It's still one of my favorite series of all time. I mean the first 2 books. The third one I still haven't reread. Moving back to the actual topic. The thing that changed after reading this book is that once I read this book, I noticed that whenever I continued reading, I just fell wholly into the story and I just kind of gave myself up to the story, which of course also opened myself up to just being influenced by books and having books change me as a person. And the second thing that this book did, I would say, is that it made me from an avid reader, because I was always reading a lot, into a book lover. And I don't think those 2 books are necessarily the same. Like, me being a book lover is the reason why I have so many antique books that I collect that I don't ever intend on reading, why I love a beautiful edition of a book, why I want to own books and why I feel the need to own books even if they're books I didn't enjoy as much necessarily, and why I usually don't go to the library, not just because they have a crappy like selection of English books, but because I just feel like even if I didn't like a book, if I have read a book, I want to see it in my collection and I want to remember it. And I think that's all thanks to this book. I mean, it might have ended up the same person anyway, we'll never know that. But I think it definitely like intensified those emotions in me. So that's why I wanted to put this book on my list. So the next one I have is Witch, which is a comic series. And I actually have all the issues of this comic series, or almost all the issues. I read it in its entirety and I absolutely love it. This was my Winx Club, basically. I never really watched Winx Club, but I read all of Witch. Anyway, the reason why this was so important to me is because the main character, I mean there's 5 main characters, there's 5 main girls, but there's one girl where I would say she's a little bit more of a main character, especially in the earlier issues. She's a bit more of the focus. And she is from a divorced family, so her parents are separated. And I don't know if I've ever talked about that on my channel before, but my parents were separated, or are separated still. I never really grew up in a whole family because they separated when I was still just 2 years old, so I don't even remember my parents being together. And I had a lot of issues as a child with just there being only representation of whole families, of happy families. Although I personally believe that every family has its issues, but anyway, that was just something that I struggled with a lot because I personally didn't have any problem with my parents being separated. I was lucky enough that I saw my dad as much as I see my mom, and I just didn't see any problem with it. I never knew anything different. I was still happy, but everywhere in the media it was still that like mom, dad, child. And you gotta have both to be happy. And I mean, it changed a little bit already, but if there was a divorce, it was like the worst thing ever for a child. And how can you be a happily growing up child with a broken home or whatever? And there are issues with the divorce in this comic series. I think there was a story arc where there's like talk about the dad coming back and whatever, and she's so happy seeing it, but ultimately she doesn't constantly suffer under the fact that her parents are divorced. She's really happy with her single mom. She loves her mom loves her, and there's of course normal like teenage issues she has with her mom, but basically it doesn't matter that her parents are separated. And I just, like, when I read this, I noticed that I really needed that. I really needed the positive representation of a divorced family. And like, not of the type of family that you otherwise have a lot in children's books, where either both parents are dead, or it's a happy family, or you just have one parent, but it's because the other parent died. So yeah, that's why this book definitely changed me and definitely helped me just come to terms with the fact that, yeah, it's okay that I come from a broken home, and what even is a broken home? It doesn't really matter. And yeah, so that's why I have this book on my list, this comic series. The next book I have is a book that's connected to the issue I talked about at the very beginning, and that is that I can almost never relate to a character in a book, and certainly not to a main character. And this book is actually the only exception, and that is Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. And I just loved reading this because for the first time ever when I read this, I felt not represented necessarily, but I felt like I could put myself in the main character's shoes and actually understand what she's going through, and also just understand her reasonings behind the decisions she made. Because usually I'm, at least sooner or later in a book, I'm like, you're making a fucking stupid decision, why are you doing this? But with Tessa, that's not the case at all, and I'm not the biggest fan. I have talked about this before on my channel. I am not the biggest fan of your sassy sword-wielding main character. That can be done very well. There are a few characters that fall into the trope that I really enjoy, but a lot of times I feel like they're just cardboard cutouts of each other and they don't bring anything new into the main character dom or something along those lines. But with Tessa, funnily enough, I've talked to a few people who say that they find her very boring as a main character, and I can see that. She's not necessarily sassy. I mean, she does have her banter with Will, but she's not like the most sassy character. She's very calm most of the time. She doesn't show a lot of emotions. She does show a lot of compassion, but like not necessarily a lot of emotions. And she's just thrust into that world, and it's not like she's like Clary and she just takes everything over, but she's kind of not passive, but she's still a little bit along for the ride. And I don't know, for some reason her main attributes are just that she's really, really nice and that she reads, and I feel like that's me, basically. She's not socially the best, but she's also not socially awkward. She isn't othered like a lot of main characters were during that time, especially in like the urban fantasy settings where you just have like the girl that's so different. She doesn't hate Jessamine, even though Jessamine is a bit of a bitch and she's the character trope of like the queen bee or something, but she still likes her a lot and she still befriends her. But yeah, I just really relate to her a lot, and that's why I wanted to put this book on this list. The next book is another one of those books that made me notice how important representation is, and that is Nihal from the Land of the Wind, the first book in the Chronicles of the Emerged World series by Licia Troisi, who is an Italian author. So again, as always when I talk about the series, which I feel like I haven't done in a long time actually. I think I haven't talked about this book in like more than a year, which I'm proud of myself. I don't know. Anyway, it's from an Italian author. I know it was translated into English, but I don't know how well the translation is done. So I would recommend the book, but I don't know if I recommend the translation. The reason why this is important to me is that this is the first time that I read a book with a female main character. And I don't know, I was so happy with that when I read it, because I read this book around the time when I discovered fantasy, and before that I read mostly like those types of books that had like a cast of multiple characters, where a lot of times the girls were also a part of the main cast, but I never really felt the same as with Witch. Like there sometimes is a cast of 5 or more main characters, but there's still that one character that's a little bit more of a main character, and that was never a girl. And also I never really related to the girls, and of course there was Harry Potter and Hermione was a great character, but she was not the main character. And directly before I read this one, or like shortly beforehand, I read Eragon and I loved it, and I discovered high fantasy and I loved high fantasy, but damn it, there were no women. And then a friend came to me and was like, hey, you should read this. It's basically Eragon, but with a female character. And I read it and I absolutely loved it. I do not relate to Nihal at all. I mean, I kind of do in a way where she feels like she's the odd one out a lot of times, which she literally is, because she's the last survivor of her race. And then she tries to be a female warrior or dragon rider, and only men are allowed to become dragon riders. So she still is the odd one out because she's the only woman, obviously. And she, especially in this first book, she struggles a lot with finding her place in the world. And when I first read this book, this was what I most related to, aside from the fact that finally, I had a female main character. I struggled a lot with finding my place, not just like in the world, but just simply in my class at school. And yeah, I just never really felt like I belonged for a long time in my life. And so I really related to those feelings a lot with Nihal, even though she, again, in the first book, she isn't like the most fun main character. She can be kind of annoying, but that's because she just has to go through a lot of character development through this whole series, but kind of seeing her persevere also just made me resolved to just stand by who I am and just to know that I will find my place in the world. And yeah, it helped me a lot, this book, and it changed me a lot, and it showed me that there are strong female characters, strong main female characters out there who aren't just relegated to the sidelines and to being the sidekick of the male characters. And if you've been on my channel for even probably a few videos, you will know which series I'm going to talk about next, which is the series that changed my life the most and which is the reason why this is my favorite series of all time. And that is the Black Jewels trilogy series by Anne Bishop. And in this series there's not necessarily any main characters that I relate to, but the thing that helped me a lot with this series, and I was talking about it earlier when I was talking about Nihil from the Land of the Wind, that I kind of had a hard time finding my place, and that I had a hard time just finding my group of friends and finding my group of people. And of course I also had a lot of troubles at home at the time when I was first reading this. I had a lot of issues with my dad, and this book helped me because a lot of Anne Bishop's books in general are about found family, and she has the best found family groups ever, and I won't accept anything else. And this story basically is about that it doesn't matter if 90% of the world doesn't understand who you are and doesn't want to accept you as you are, as long as you have your few people who do and who love you the way you are. And that was just something that I really needed at the time when I first read this. And I also have talked about it before that I first read this book when I was 11 or 12, which I wouldn't recommend because there's a lot of rape and physical abuse, sexual abuse in this series. However, I don't think I even properly understood those parts. And the reasons why I loved it so much is just seeing Yanel go from a very abusive background with her family, where she just struggles so hard to be who they want her to be and to just be accepted by them, and just turn into this woman just through love and through meeting people who accept her as she was, just to turn into this amazingly confident young woman. And I think that's what I needed at the time, because I was at a place where I didn't really feel like I fit in anywhere. I struggled a lot with my dad to make him accept me, even though I never really felt like I was good enough for him. And it mirrored a lot of things that were going on in my life, and it helped me a lot making those first steps into self-acceptance and self-worth, and into accepting that I don't really need to be friends with people who won't want to be friends with who I really am. And yeah, so I'm still not 100% of the way, of course, because I mean, this has been going on for 10 plus years, but it's a long way. And yeah, so that's why this book is so important to me. I can't even put it into words how important this series is to me, to be honest, because then I would have to go into a whole lot of issues of myself that I don't really want to get into right now. So safe to say, I love this book. You should go read it, especially if you're a Sarah J. Maas fan, because this is the book that she based a lot of her stuff on. Yeah. Not getting into that right now. But yeah, that was it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!